Let's start with setting up a service. And for this, we can stay in the AWS world. And here we want to use a service called S3, which is a file storage service, which is really optimized for storing files and which also can serve files. Now in the S3 console, we want to create a new bucket, which is like a new folder, you could say. And you can give this bucket any name of your choice. I'll name it Django blog, but bucket names must be unique globally, so let's see if that name is available. Now I will remove the block all public access checkbox here because we do want to access this bucket publicly. We want to be able to upload files from our running Django application, which runs on a different server, on a different machine, and we want to be able to fetch the files and deliver them to our users from all over the world. So this bucket and the files in there should be publicly accessible. Even though we get warned here, but that is what we need here. It's just warning you because in other use cases, you might not want to expose your files to the public. Here, we want to be able to do that. Now let's create this bucket, and yeah, the name is taken. So let me add a dash course thereafter and see if that's available. Yeah, that's working. So now we got this bucket added, this bucket here, and now we can upload files. But we don't want to upload them manually. Instead, that should be done automatically. For example, when we run the collect static command, but also when a user uploads a file, it should then be forwarded into that bucket. Now, to achieve this, we need to do a couple of things. And let's start by ensuring that visitors of our website will be able to request those static files which will be hosted in this S3 bucket. In the next step thereafter, we'll make sure that the files get there, but let's start with exposing the files which will eventually be there in the future. First of all, go to Properties on your bucket here, and then go to Static Website Hosting. Click on Edit there, and click on Enable. Choose Host a Static Website, even though we're not hosting a website, but we will be delivering assets that belong to a website, and leave the rest as it is here. And then click Save Changes. And since we need some input here, you can fill in any values here. That does not matter because we won't be serving a website here anyways. So you can fill any values you want into the fields for index document and error document, and then save this. Now next, let's go to Permissions here, and there go to the Cross-Origin Resource Sharing section and click on Edit. Now here you can paste in the configuration which you find attached to this lecture. This in the end will ensure that the resources can be fetched from different domains. So also from our Django application, which is hosted on Elastic Beanstalk, which will have a different address than this bucket. So that's why we need to enable our hosted application running with Elastic Beanstalk to be able to reach out to these files, which are hosted on a different server, if you want to call it like this, by AWS S3. Then click on Save Changes, and we should be good. Now let's stay in Permissions, and let's go to the bucket policy and click on Edit there. Now here we want to ensure that requests can reach this bucket. We did remove this checkbox granting public access, but we still need to explicitly enable that public access. And that's what we do with this policy. For this, you can copy in the attached bucket policy and make sure that you replace example-bucket here with your concrete bucket name. In my case, Django-blog-course. So whatever you picked as a bucket name should go in here. And then you can save these changes as well. With those settings applied, we will be able to fetch data from the bucket. So we will be able to fetch any files that are stored in that bucket. But at the moment, there are no such files, of course. Now we need to make sure that when we collect static files, they are uploaded, and that when users upload files, they are forwarded to that bucket. For this, we need to grant our Django application write access to our bucket. And to do this in a secure way, we need to go to another AWS service first, the IAM service, which stands for Identity Access Management, which is basically a service that allows us to grant other users or applications access to our AWS account or to services in this AWS account. And here we want to go to Groups and create a new group. Now I'll name this group Django Blog Course. The name is up to you though. And click on Next Step. Here we now want to add policies, which basically controls which kind of permissions users in that group will have. And here we want to set up as little permissions as possible to restrict the kind of access our Django app has to this bucket in the end to only what's needed. This is important for security reasons. If we would grant a lot of permissions, if we would open this up entirely, if anyone ever gets access to our Django application, that person could do a lot of harm to our AWS account. That's why we want to be very restrictive here. So now therefore we want to select the kind of policies, the kind of permissions we want to add to users in this group. And here we want to search for S3 full access and add this policy. So check this policy, the Amazon S3 full access policy, and click Next and click Create Group. And that creates this group now. Now we just need to add a user which we add to that group. So for this, we can click on Users and add a new user here. Here I'll also name this Django Blog User. And under access type, we'll use programmatic access. This is not a human user who should be able to use this console here. Instead, our application, our Django application will be the user later. And it will only communicate with AWS through APIs, so only programmatically. That's why we check this kind of access. Then click Next, and we don't manage the permissions for this user specifically, but we add this user to the Django Blog Course group, which we just created. And then we click on Next. We don't need to enter anything here. Click on Next Review and click on Create User. Now this creates this user, and now here, don't close this page yet. Instead here, we'll have important credentials which we'll need to use in a second to connect Django through that user to AWS to let it manage files on our behalf in this S3 service. Now we can simply download this CSV file though to make sure we don't lose that data, and then we can close this since that file will contain it. Now that we got AWS set up, let's go back to our project and to our code. And there we now also need to make a couple of changes to ensure that this Django application is able to utilize this new AWS user we created and send files there. For this, we'll first of all install new packages which help us with that. We're going to install two new packages with pip install, and that's the Django-storages package, and the S at the end is important. It's storages, not storage, and the Bodo-free package. The Django-storages package allows us to change the way Django handles local files, and Bodo-free is essentially the official AWS SDK for Python, which allows us to communicate with AWS services programmatically from inside Python applications. And we need that combined with Django storages to tell Django to send files to AWS. So we need to install these two packages here. And once they are installed, we can already run pip freeze again so that we don't forget this to update our requirements text file with those new packages, which are now required as well. So now that this is installed, we need to dive into the Django settings again to control how Django stores and manages files. For this, first of all, we need to go to Installed Apps and there add a new app, the Storages app. The S at the end is important still. This is this Django storages package, which we now added, which we need to hook into this Django project in order to be able to override the default storage mechanism. Now we also need to add a couple of other settings. We can do this here at the end, it doesn't really matter. We need to add a couple of AWS specific settings, which will be picked up soon by the Bodo free package, to tell Django and Python how to communicate with our AWS account. Because of course we need to give Django and Python some information about our account for it to connect successfully. For this we add a AWS underscore storage underscore bucket underscore name variable. And for all the variables I'm about to add, you need to make sure that you avoid typos. So here it's AWS storage bucket name with underscores. And then here we add our bucket name, which we set up. Django-blog-course in my case. You should of course use your bucket name here. Next, we add the AWS S3 region name. And here, you want to use the region you used for setting up your bucket. And you can find this if you go to S3, click on your bucket, properties. Here, there's the region, and it's this US East 1 string in my case, which I need to store in a string here. The next setting which we add here is AWS access key ID. And now here we need a value from our user, which we created. So that's why I did download this CSV file. This contains the credentials which we need now. So open this file with a regular text editor and then grab your access key ID, which should look something like this, and also add your AWS secret access key as a new variable. And that's also to be found in this file, and it looks something like this here. Let's add it like this. Now, just as with other settings, make sure you don't share them with others. I will delete this user once I'm done recording, so I can share this with you, but you want to make sure you don't share it with others if there is the danger of sharing it, or if you do plan on putting your code on GitHub, use environment variables instead, and make sure that you set the environment variables in places which are not shared with others. Now we also need to add a AWS S3 custom domain here. And that can be a F string where we basically reuse our AWS storage bucket name. So this variable from up here, and combine this with .s3.amazonaws.com. That builds a domain which is automatically generated by AWS, which grants access to our files stored in our bucket. Now, as a next step, we can add the static files storage key here and set this to storages.backends.s3bodofree.s3bodofree storage. Like this, and make sure you got the casing right, especially here in the last part of that string. Static files storage is an official Django setting which tells Django how files should be stored. In the official docs, we can learn that the default is this static files storage built into Django. Now we're swapping this default with the S3bodo storage in the end, which will move those static files to AWS S3 instead. And now we can save all of that, and before we deploy anything, we can test whether this generally works by simply running python manage_py collect static again. And this should now again collect all our static files, but now it should move them and upload them to our S3 bucket instead of a local folder. So here, let's type yes. Let's see whether that works. Now it can take a while, since it of course is uploading those files to the S3 bucket now. And after a while, that should complete. And if you have a look at your S3 bucket content and you refresh there, you should see the uploaded files here, which proves that this works and that the connection is generally enabled. Now we can also try this locally by starting our server with run server, but by adding the -- no static flag thereafter. If you run the dev server like this, it is started as always, but it will not serve static files. But if I visit localhost 8000, I still see the files, not this uploaded image, because keep in mind, that's stored on our deployed server, but I do see the styling and this image, and that kind of indicates that it works. And we can double check that it works if we open up our console, and we get one error for this uploaded file, which is to be expected, but we see in the head section, for example, that these styles are indeed requested from our AWS S3 bucket now. And since we got styling, they were requested successfully. So that worked, and we can quit this development server now. So the connection is established, and with that we're almost done. We also need to make sure that uploaded files end up on the S3 bucket though. And currently we're only setting this for static files. Now, just as we have the static files storage key here, there also is a default file storage key which you can set. Another official setting Django offers to you. Now, the default file storage will be used for those media files. And now it might be tempting to use the same value here as we do for static files storage. This would also upload media files to our bucket. But this would introduce the security risk I mentioned earlier in this module. If we upload user files to the same folder as we use for our static files, then we allow users to overwrite our files in the end. And we don't want to do that. That would be a security problem. Therefore, we don't want to use the same storage here. But of course, we do want to use S3 as a storage. So how can we work around that? Well, we can also build our own storage system, which under the hood uses this Bodo-free S3 storage, but which then has greater control over the different subfolders in our bucket where the different files should be moved. And hence, that's what we're going to do now.